Good morning, everyone. I'm Raj Tripathi. I'm the Assistant Director for Higher Education Research for British Council. And I welcome you all to the British Council Delhi office for the program Lessons from India Transforming Foundational Learning. The event is hosted by British Council on behalf of the FCDO and its GEEAP co-convenors, World Bank and UNICEF, comprising of a day-long debate and deliberations followed by an early evening reception. The session proceedings will explore evidence experience from Global Education Evidence Advisory Panel and experiences from implementation of National Education Policy. With this, I would request Rittika, Director Higher Education, to start the proceedings of the day. Rittika, over to you.
So good morning and a very warm welcome to you at the British Council here, both literally and figuratively, we've been having face-to-face program in this particular auditorium for the last 6 months after a gap of 2 years. And we found that it was a great learning for us to restart, because we realized that after hundreds of testing and checking, halfway through a program with 25,000 people, our projector just gave way. And we realized that things, when they heat up, tend to fall apart, particularly if they've been lying unused for some time. And I share that story with you because we found that restarting after this gap, even in this tight, small context, was so complex for us that I really admire, respect, and think very highly of all the educators, education policy makers, those who work in school, those who research it, who are starting out in such a very complex ecosystem. And I cannot, fathom the challenges that you all have to face in your work area. So, I kind of look forward to the conversation that we are going to have today and hope that some of those will help, resolve or make it easier and make it better for the children in the schools in the context in which you're working. So that's our interest in hosting this here at the British Council. I had a colleague who worked with us on from another organization, Sam Friedman, and he was talking about research because that's not something British Council usually does, and he said to us that everything in research will work somewhere, but all things will not work everywhere. And the key trick is understanding which of these recommendations, which of the research findings will work in your context. And that's a trick, that you'll have to figure out through the conversations, through experiences of others, and, through listening and, to the other people. So as Rachel said to me a minute ago, conversation is everything, which is why we don't have loads and loads of people in the room, because if it becomes very, very crowded, it becomes difficult to have those personalized conversations in person. I wanted to also share with you 2 projects that British Council did, at the start. One was a little way before. We started it about 4 months before the COVID hit us, and that was the CBSC competency-based education on assessment. Some of you would have been engaged in that, and it was one of the exciting programs that we did with the CBSC. And the other project was a tiny one that we did with Macmillan Education in trying to scramble together a quick online everyday English response for the Delhi government. And I mentioned the 2 projects because in doing both of them, we learned a lot on the job. And we learned to respond quickly. We didn't have the luxury of thinking too much in those situations. But in the spirit of fostering conversation. I'm not going to tell you any more about them. There are CBSE colleagues amongst us, and there are colleagues who have been a part of the Macmillan Project, British Council colleagues. There's going to be tea breaks and lunch breaks and receptions. Find them and find out more about those, because that's what this today is all about in that sense. So that's what I would like to encourage you to do. And lastly, I'd like to thank the FCDO colleagues, their research hub, the colleagues from Mannion Daniels, Charlie, who's here with us, Victoria Collis, Vicky Collis, who's in River Path. Most of the things that I say to you in any other panel is something that she's fed into at all hours of day and night over weekend and other times. So really, really grateful to her for that support and for keeping us on the straight and the narrow through this period of time. We are at the British Council, another cue for conversation that you might like to take forward, are having a big brainstorm on what we can do around supporting computational thinking, critical skills thinking in schools from classes 5 to 10 that makes sense to children at that point, And we're still looking for ideas. So if you have an idea which you think is something that we should be thinking about doing, again, grab a British Council colleague and tell them about it, and we will kind of look at it and consider it as we go forward. So that's the appeal from my side to all of you. And overall, despite the turmoil of the past year, the most important thing is that we are here on the other side. I believe that none of us have not been touched in one way or the other, directly or indirectly. And it's been a difficult time. But we are at the other side, and I think it's a very appropriate moment to reflect, because we rarely pause, because we are scrambling so much to deliver. And this is a moment for us to stop, to reflect a bit, and to see if we can improve what we are doing as we go forward. So I do hope that it will be a useful day for all of you who've taken the trouble to be with us and who will join us in the course of the day. And thank you for coming and being with us. With that, I'd like to call upon Rita Sharma, who leads the South Asia Research Hub for the FCDO, to say a few words to us. Rita, please.
Good morning, everyone. Rittika has really nicely set the stage for today's discussion, and I'm really pleased to be amongst all of you, such an esteemed audience. And to start off, I just wanted to give a bit of context to the FCDO's engagement on the evidence side in the region. So I'm part of the FCDO, which is the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office of the UK, which combines diplomacy with development. It's a new department that has been set up in 2020, under which there is the Research and Evidence Directorate, which is led by Professor Charlotte Watts, whom some of you may have heard of. And the main goal of the department is to ensure the use of evidence for effective delivery of programs. And what it does is, through its centrally managed programs, it generates scientific global public goods. And the program that you'll be discussing today is part of such a project. But apart from this, they also have 5 regional hubs that are spread across Africa, 3 in Africa, 1 in Asia, and 1 in the UK. I'm part of the South Asia Research Hub, which is based in Kathmandu and Delhi. It's a small hub of 6 people, which caters to 6 countries in South Asia, which are Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. And since last year, we have also extended our evidence support and offer to countries in Southeast Asia, and we've got a number of projects. We have funding there in countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. We have 2 main objectives. One is to help the FCDO country offices to access and use evidence to tackle development challenges in FCDO's priority areas, more on climate, biodiversity, COVID, health, girls' education, and gender, tech, and innovation. And the second objective is around supporting science partnerships for development, which is aimed at generating new and high-quality research outputs under which we work very closely with country funders as well as research institutions. So the Research and Evidence Directorate invests a lot in education, and I wanted to highlight one particular example where we've worked to support an innovative longitudinal study led by Young India that followed lives of 12,000 children in India, Ethiopia, Peru, and Vietnam over 15 years. And it provided unique evidence on drivers and impacts of child poverty to inform policy and program designs. So how we supplemented this from the South Asia Research Hub is that we worked to provide support for a specific research question that was focused on disability in India through deep interviews, and this was done at the peak of COVID. The study provided new insights and generated policy recommendations that led to provision of barefoot counselors at community level to support families with disabilities. So as an organization and also as a country, we deeply care about evidence. And the UK has presence in the region to facilitate this through the hubs that are here. And we do recognize that, commitment to strengthen the evidence is just a start. And actually delivering the change is long and hard journey. And this event is an important event in that journey. So with that, I'll like to wish you a really fruitful discussion today and I look forward to hearing the discussions. Thank you very much.
So we now would like to have the panel session with the GEEAP co-conveners. I don't know whether GEEAP is the right way to call this, but we'll go with that for now. So can I call on Terry Durnnian, who is the Chief of Education of UNICEF India. Pradyumna, the Education Specialist for World Bank. Thanks, Terry. Do you want to take a seat? And Rachel Hinton, who is the team lead for education research team for the FCDO. So Rachel is also the visiting fellow of practice at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. And we are delighted to have her. I'd like to introduce to you, if you can bring on the next slide, a little bit about the Global Education Advisory Panel, which was convened in 2020 with the World Bank, the UNICEF, the Office of Research Innocenti, and the UK's Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Currently, it consists of 13 economics, I'm sorry, my throat is a little down, educationalists, psychologists, policymakers, drawn from institutions around the world. The GEEAP is modeled on a high-level advisory structure already in common in the health sector, using rigorous evidence to influence public policymaking with a focus on learning outcomes. The GEEAP's first publication, the Smart Buys paper, examined global evidence to identify investments that are most likely to have substantive impact on learning levels in school. Earlier this year, the GEEAP launched a second paper that looked at what emerging evidence is telling us about how to tackle COVID-19 and related learning losses. We are here today to talk in details about one of the recommendations from that paper, which is also a major focus for India, the importance of getting it right. So, will you just join you here?
Yes, ma'am.
It's on. This one. So thank you for being with us, all of you. It's very important for all of the people here to listen to you, and then all those who might listen afterwards on the digital medium. So I'll start off with Rachel, And you've been working personally with GEEAP, and since its inception, why do you think we need a panel like this to come together? What does it do? If you can tell us a bit about that.
Sure.
Do you want that? Or do you want to try that?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm actually going to move over here so I can show you a couple of slides as I answer your question, please. So that was just to give you a picture of those people that Rittika was telling you about who are on the panel. And we all know that this global crisis has exacerbated the problem. There were 1.6 billion children actually out of school at the height of the pandemic. That's a huge number of children. And the subsequent learning loss for them all is actually enormous. And for countries and governments, their financial resources, of course, are further stretched, if you like, than ever before. And so governments are really seeking solutions. So the two papers that Rittika was talking about is the main one on COVID learning loss, and the original one on smart buys. In 2015, I don't think I need this one. So in 2015, I had the great privilege to go to Uttar Pradesh to visit with Lant Pritchett. Many will know about the research program on improving systems of education. And we went with Kartik Muralidharan and Abhijit Singh, and it's also a program with Yamini Iyer and others involved. And we went to the district office, and it's a program looking at those school improvement plans. But this district official, as you can imagine him sitting in his office, he was in despair. He said he'd spent most of the day listening to different donors and different foundations coming to him to sell their interventions. And they all said they had robust evidence of the impact. They wanted his blessing, but they didn't just want his blessing. They wanted his staff. They wanted his staff to implement their program, to go to their trainings, to evaluate the program. And yet he said, look, I don't have the knowledge or evidence to know which of these interventions I should be saying yes to, which I should support and which I shouldn't. And so not only are we no longer well coordinated, but we don't have really well synthesized evidence to help these decision makers take those choices. And actually there's been, partly because of this, a real rapid increase in the requests for the advice from the evidence bases. And unfortunately, unlike, I'm going to go just back to this one, because unlike in other sectors, you'll have all heard of the IPCC, the International Panel for Climate Change. We all have heard of the WHO panels in health. But actually, this is the first time in the education sector that we had a group of experts from across the disciplines and across the globe to come together to say, yes, we will agree which evidence is robust and has an impact, and which we actually need, should set aside and need more studies on. And so it really is, Rittika, it's a time to celebrate that we have this body already. We do have some bodies that synthesize evidence. You'll know of 3IE, for example. They put together evidence on different development programs, including education. We have the JPAL series, and you're fortunate here in Delhi to have some brilliant researchers from JPAL who've really contributed to the evidence base, and they synthesize a lot of the insights. But what we've got now is this group who can help us get out into the public domain and help translate that evidence for those who need it. And the other key dimension of why it's important is that it's the first time we have a measure of learning. So again, I can see nods when we talk about a DALI, that in health they've had a measure of daily adjusted life use for many years. And so now we have for the first time a measure called the Life-Adjusted Years of Schooling, the LAYS, where we can say this intervention will have a certain impact in relation to learning outcomes. And so, again, this is a bit of evidence that's been missing for a long time when we talk to decision makers, not just whether it works, but at what cost does it work. So why such meetings? We've been talking a lot about pillars of impact, and this diagram just shows that we like operating in our own sectors. If I'm an academic, I sit in my research cylinder, if you like, and my incentives operate in that cylinder. I'm comfortable. I'm comfortable because I get recognition from my peers. I get on with them. I know them. I'm comfortable because my reward system is understood. If I'm a researcher, that's how many peer-reviewed publications I get. If I'm a donor, that's whether I'm spending my budget according to my log frame. Or if I'm a policymaker, the extent to which my manifesto commitments are being met. And I'm comfortable because I think alike. But the bold reform only really happens when this triangle interacts, when we come outside our comfort zones and we're sharing our knowledge with each other, and in a two-way interaction, not just in a top-down pushing evidence onto the policymakers' table, but genuinely listening to what the policymakers also need and responding to it. And I don't think, certainly as donors, we've been very good at that listening. So what's the impact been so far? You said, what has the impact been? Well, one thing, of course, is that it has brought these different silos, as I call them, together. It's brought us round a table. And it's clear that this type of evidence is needed. We've had over 25,000 downloads of the report from all around the world. People are hungry to know what works. People want solutions. Kenya, for example, so we've had GEEAP events from all around the world, and a lot of people demanding advice and support. But the most useful discussion really happens when you can sit down together and get into those places where you're uncomfortable, where your preconceived notions are perhaps challenged by the evidence. And so we were very lucky to have one of these events in Kenya. And in Kenya, many of you will know a program called Tusome, where they adjust instruction to the level of the child. And it acknowledges how important it is to listen and assess children where they're at, and then make sure the teaching is at that level. But how do you take that to scale? How do you ensure it's resourced? How do you take it to different parts of the country that are very different in context? And we were fortunate that Ruth Kagia there at the President's office is very committed to this and using technology to help accelerate progress. And so we had deep debate. She came back over to the Education World Forum Room and then came over to Oxford to learn from other research programs like RISE and the Young Lives program from all around the world. As we heard earlier from Rita, it also operates here in India as well. And just a couple more to give you an illustration. In Tanzania as well, the discussions there, they had a 3-day event that I think is very interesting. It's called Utafiti Elimu Tanzania, and it was led by government, 170 participants, actually saying we need longer than just a few hours. We need to sit and debate and discuss over a period of time with government officials to think about and adjust our policies and our programming. And they are planning to make this an annual event that feeds into the policy cycle. So again, that's something that some of you might want to reflect on in the time we have today. There's a lot of meetings and discussions that are always held in Delhi, and we've had in the past joint review missions and so on that also go and visit sites and look at progress and what happens. And finally, I just say I think that we've got the opportunity today to think and talk more and reflect on what might make a difference here for the bold policy that has been implemented recently here for the country and all of the millions of children who deserve a better future. Thank you.
Change the order, just to mix it up a bit. So the next question is to Pradyumna. That is that, there was actually a quiz for the audience. Of all the pictures that you've seen there today, there's one person in the room, and you will have to soon meet and identify the person. But actually, Rukmini, the interesting thing is that of the 13, 3 of them come from an Indian background, and is it reflective of the lessons that you're learning from India, and what are those lessons? If you can share some of that with us.
Yeah, thank you, Rittika. So I've actually gotten so used to sort of reading off of the screen over the last 2 years in all panels that I was like, okay, diligently I'm going to prepare notes, but I'm going to sort of take cue from the conversation and sort of keep it conversation. I also realized after arriving here that, yeah, I don't need to sort of share and transfer knowledge. I think it's just sort of,
churn it up.
Sort of bringing up, sort of reflecting on what we've seen, reflecting on some of these lessons, and probably positioning them up for a conversation today after this. So I think there are 3 to 4 things that I do think that we need to sort of look at. And this was an interesting reflective exercise for me too, as I was sort of thinking about this. So I think first and foremost, right, when we think about learning poverty, we always jump to learning. But we also forget that there is a part of learning poverty that actually talks about schooling deficient children, right? So children who are not actually in school. And one of the challenges that we're sort of going to have to deal with right now is to get children back to school. As I was reflecting on, for example, the Indian experience, and this probably definitely does get sort of a lot of, I think, space in the GEEAP report, is that we have to get children back to school. And as a system, as a large system, federated structure, I think there are several sort of lessons we can draw if we were to sort of take a look back at some of the mission mode work that the government of India, as well as the state governments, have done in terms of being able to bring back children, in being able to retain children, right? So if we were to, for example, look at the midday meal scheme or the integrated child development services scheme, or for example, just the drive of the government to bring sort of to increase access and enrollment, I think there are very interesting lessons that we right now almost take for granted, but which will probably serve us well as we move ahead. And I think some of it goes to the focus that you put on a system to sort of cohere together, come together and say, this is the goal we need to achieve, and this is what we need to sort of ensure at the end of the intervention that happens, which is, I think, what the GEEAP report also talks about. I think the second sort of area that will be interesting for us to discuss is the following, right? Which is that we have had a lot of dialogue and conversation and disparate interventions in foundational learning. I think because of the jolt that COVID gave us, we've sort of started realizing how critical it is to sort of focus on it. Very interestingly, and Vipin sir will sort of talk about this later, I think, the government of India, along with the states, sort of are launching their own versions of these foundational and remedial learning programs, which are sort of these systematic programs, bringing in, for example, teaching at the right level, systematic pedagogy, a lot of support to teachers, one-on-one mentoring, all of these methods. And they've been able to galvanize the system to actually deliver on these goals, right? So, and we're seeing interesting patterns come up, right? From, say, actually saying, can we get parents, children, teachers aware of where they need to be, aware of where they are? Secondly, can we sort of ensure that our teachers are supported, and not just with resources and operational support, but also with the political cover to actually do foundational learning and not just complete the syllabus. I think the third very interesting thing is that after doing all of this, I think we've also sort of started gearing up the entire value chain from, say, a State Council of Educational Research and Training to District Institute of Education and Training, and the officers who come after that, to helping, I think, meet this goal. And I think there are going to be very interesting lessons emerging from this area of at-scale implementation of when do you take these disparate sort of interventions and bring them together, what does it mean? I think the third point that I'd like to sort of just quickly reference is that there's this whole sort of, and I'm going to refer to my notes here, sorry. Sure. I think we really need significant investments in technology and data. I think one things that we take for granted in India right now, which is educational television, educational radio, the UDI systems, for example, are mammoth efforts. They have taken decades to sort of, bring to life. And probably the consciousness that was there in the government systems and in the public around using technology is probably the reason we were able to still swiftly make whatever transitions to alternative modes of delivery we could when COVID struck. And I think that resilience in the system is something that we'll have to keep on building as we see more climate-related impacts, for example. Right. I think I'd just like to sort of end the conversation saying that I think there's one part of the conversation that we often take for granted, which starting to sort of realize as I look at more of these missions and more of these efforts and global sort of national initiatives, is that we have an education policy which is grounded in research and which sort of reflects key insights from research. And I think that's going to be a key aspect of sort of building back systems better in other countries. So to summarize, I would say sort of having that policy which is grounded in research, and then following it up with sort of lessons from bringing children back to school, getting them to stay, getting them, ensuring that they have the foundational learning, and after that, sort of having the technology to ensure sort of resilience. I would say are interesting probably areas for discussion today. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for that. And in fact, the interesting thing about the grounded in research and also taking into consideration the widest level of consultation, I think we had some 6 lakh pieces of inputs from the wider audience, practitioners, and everybody into that document, which is truly a remarkable achievement in one sense to synthesize so much of people's voices and build it into a coherent whole is like a mammoth task in that sense. So it's fascinating in many ways. So coming to you, Terry, is something that is looking at, because UNICEF does such a lot of work on ground in many ways. How is the evidence shaping out in the research talking about the way in which foundational learning will go forward, and there'll be equity in that sense? And is there any aspect of inclusion also that the UNICEF is looking at in that sense within this story?
Okay, I think the question shifted around. I think there's a lot happening in terms of the areas of evidence in India. Yeah. At the national as well as at the individual state level. We're engaged at, I think, 17 states across the country and supporting really state governments in terms of rolling out, as well as the national level. And I think one of the big pieces of work which the ministry's done was the National Assessment Survey that came out in November 2021. Which really gives a critical picture or view on terms of the impact of COVID on children and their learning, which is very, very critical. And I think talking about, so I think that's will be a very key point of evidence. And I know, for example, next week, in addition, they're launching their state report card on this. And bringing in, shifting maybe from inclusion to equity, really looking at the issues of diving deep into what this information is telling us. When we're looking at evidence, you can take it at this level or a bit deeper in terms of what this information is telling us about the most marginalized. Yeah. And for the NAS, who are the children really not achieving? Scheduled tribes, rural, and at the poorest quintile. And I think this information is very critical. Because I think there's a lot of information, evidence, and I think this afternoon this will come up in the panel, and it's really coming back to how is it being used? How is it informing policy and planning at the state level? How are they taking, and I know individual states do their own internal evidence generation. That's not in public domain. I think most states do that, which is excellent. But how are they taking the lessons, the information, or lessons from NAS, and how is that influencing decisions they're taking in their Nippon Bhattacharjee five-year indicated plans that all states have developed? How are they making the most vulnerable or excluded children visible in their plans? So children with disabilities, are they really visible in these plans? And I think that's a crucial area of work. Because I think a lot of I think with, as mentioned, the NAS, with the NEP and Nippon Bhattacharjee, I think it's stimulated a lot of discussion at the state level, realizing things they need to know, the gaps. And I think that's, when you're looking at evidence, it's a question of what is it telling you, but what is it not telling you? Yes. Where are the gaps? And for example, a lot of states are looking at issues around language, and looking at the language that children understand, and language mapping. Tomorrow I'm going to Chhattisgarh where the state government's presenting their language mapping. And how will that inform, especially early grades, how's the basis, beginning with children, the language children understand and know, support foundational literacy and numeracy, and eventually transitioning, supporting oral to written to the state language. And I think in 2 weeks, Rajasthan will be doing the same, presenting their language mapping. And how is that informing their plans around Nippon Bhattacharjee? So really, if you look at it individual state level, that all children benefit. And that evidence is really going below the surface in terms of where the gaps, where does it need to focus, in terms of moving forward, and where's the investment need to be made. I think that's very, very critical. And I see that happening. A lot of states have committees, working groups. You see civil society and non-government agencies coming together. How can we collaboratively support state governments? I think you mentioned in terms of how do non-state actors really come together and support states, as well as the national level, in terms of ideas around evidence generation, filling the gaps, and suggestions of how they may operationalize, realizing at the end of the game, it's really the government needs to make decisions, like you said, what they will do for the best interests of the children in their states. And I think, as you mentioned before, it's looking at how's that support system for teachers to enable them to do that, and what is the evidence telling us? Because there's exceptionally good practice happening in India, but often it's not being institutionalized and supported, and really, I think the evidence is telling us it's investment over the longer term for the biggest benefit, and not looking at quick fixes. And I think if you're looking at, I mean, we're really entering the first year after COVID, first school year, and how states are planning, recognizing, okay, children are not where they should be in their learning. I'll mention later, I was just in Connecticut looking in a classroom and how they're planning to doing classroom assessments. what is that telling? How is that informing practice, teaching practice? And looking at a year-long program to support children, but also looking at where children are and where they need to go. So I think it's really how are these good practices based on evidence are raised up and sustained within the system going forward. Thank you.
No, thank you. And it's so interesting because, the thing is that getting the NEP has ambitions for young people learning in their own mother tongue and their own languages. And the challenge of linguistically diverse country, making that so interesting that each person is able to get what they need at their foundational level and so critical to their foundational.
And I think, I think for me, coming in as essentially a unilingual English speaker, I will confess, is my confession. Being amazed of the languages that circulate in one room. I mean, we look at the languages in this room, it won't be one, it won't be two. We may be looking at 3 or 4.
Yeah, at least.
But how is the classroom supporting that?
Yeah.
Effectively, multi-level, multilingual, but it's happening.
It's happening, yes.
Because it's a language of instruction, often the language of the home, and the language of the wider community, and then there's the big E word floating around, English.
Yes, that's fascinating. I really enjoyed listening to the challenge, Rachel, around lots of people going with lots of evidence, and it's fantastic that lots of people want to help, but ensuring that they're all pulling in the same direction based on evidence is the real challenge, in that sense, and hope will be addressed through some of this. And so, one of the questions I had for Pradyumna was, how do you suggest, the best practices around personalization? So, language is one diversity, but there are other individual diversities. So, do we have evidence of what's worked on personalization of education at this scale?
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, obviously, when we look at just the scales and the numbers, it seems to be a daunting task. But I think the part which is probably daunting but also liberating is that essentially, at the end of the day, what we have to focus on is classroom transactions, the interactions amongst teachers, amongst students, and amongst teachers and students. And there are certain interesting insights which are actually interestingly in this report. So I think the first thing we've got to acknowledge is that we do need resources. We do need sufficient investments for each child and for each teacher to have what she needs. And that's something that, in fact, the NEP talks about. And in the current context and in generally most fiscally sort of constrained, I think, sort of systems, we will have to think very deliberately about school complexes, about sort of efficient sort of, resource management in school complexes, because that's the way we'll probably be able to ensure that every child and every teacher has what she needs. Because we know the physical space is limited, so we might still increase it, but we still may need to sort of think about efficient resource management, especially as enrollment numbers in government schools across the world are increasing. Right? I think the second thing is that we cannot ever overstate the role of teachers. They will be central to any sort of, I think, initiative that we'll have to pull in. So ensuring teachers get continuous support and not once a year support, maybe in a workshop. On-ground supports, wherein they're able to collaborate, problem solve together, because like you correctly pointed out, the problems are local, and they need local solutions that will have to be figured out collaboratively by people who can understand each other's context and are probably best placed to help each other rather than someone coming in from outside. And that's where probably we'll need to ensure, sort of support which is on ground, which is based on what's happening in the classroom, based on the realities of the context, and where people, teachers, get chance to sort of reclaim their agency by working together as collaborators and problem solvers and solving the problems that they face day in and day out. and obviously based in what's actually happening in the classroom, often which does not happen in teacher training. I think the third aspect that, and I think this is something we've talked about several times, and thankfully, a lot of countries have momentum in this area, is the area of assessments. We have been building, I think, through civil society organizations as well as governments, a lot of momentum on assessments of learning. I think there is right now certainly also a need to equip sort of the teachers and the last mile functionaries with the skills, knowledge, and I think the tools to help them assess for learning. If teachers may have all the resources in the world, but if they don't know where their students are, they'll not be able to meet them where they are. And that's the foundation of foundational learning. You've got to meet them where students are. I think the fourth part, and any discussion would be incomplete without it, is that all of these functions can only probably be amplified using technology. It is definitely not an end-all and be-all solution for all, but it is certainly, if there is systemic capacity to absorb technology, something that will have to be considered given the scales and the resilience challenges that we'll continue to sort of deal with. So to summarize, I would say sort of focusing on teachers, ensuring efficient and effective sort of allocation of resources. Third, ensuring that we are sort of assessing and meeting children where they are. Would probably be sort of the key aspects that we could focus on going forward. Yeah.
No, that makes sense, because if you're going to teach at the right level, you have to support teachers at the right level as well in that sense, and all teachers at the right level in that thing. So I'm going to come to an audience questions. We'll have time to take 2 questions as we go forward. But while you're thinking of the question, I'm going to ask Rachel one last question. What do you think we should aim to achieve out of a meeting like this? What would you say success will look like at the end of today?
Thank you. I mean, I think these sorts of meetings are a chance for us to listen. I think we heard Terry just now talk about using evidence. But have we listened to the demands from government, for example, that they want to enhance their own capabilities to use evidence? Do they have the staff with those skills that they've been requesting? We need to listen to whether we actually have the skills and the needs for the analysis of data and access to all of that data from MIS units, from our own statistics offices, from finance ministries around funding, for example. And we need to listen to the demands from people like Ali in that office in UP, for researchers also to provide cost data for them to make decisions. So I think much of those requests have gone unheard, actually, and health sector, for example, Brookings estimate has 10 times more resources in research than our sector does. And so I think that one of the things we need to do is invest in this, and it's not a lack of will. It's often us moving this forward. And I'm happy to say one of the things that actually we have been launching is a new What Works global hub on global education alongside our partners from the Bank and UNICEF and Gates Foundation and others. This is 55 million in the first instance, but to help governments build their own capability to assess and use data and commission the evidence that they need at the time they need it. And I think, again, we've been too slow to do this, and very often the research agendas are driven from the global north. And so I hope that today's meeting and meetings like this allow us to listen and hear what the needs are in the room in this country for these states. And it's a starting point because, of course, those conversations then need to happen at state level and at local level. But I think it's, we're all here today. Yeah, I mean, we're all here today because we care about the future of our children.
So I'm just going to ask Anu if you can go across to the mic. Yeah. Please tell us.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I'm Dr. Manimala Roy. I'm the principal of a school. My first question is to Pradyumna. You have mentioned a lot of incentives that government has planned for keeping children in school. They are very true, but in recent times, my research showed that after the new economic policy was introduced, many slum children on their own have started sending their many slum dwellers on their own have started sending their children to school. They did not wait for government incentives. But presently, during the lockdown, many of them have lost their jobs and they have gone back to their own villages. And many of them, being a school principal, I know that many of those children have not come back to join school. So what will happen? And a lot of psychological issues are also coming up. Some of those parents, maybe not many, but committed suicide. So the children have uncertain futures. So do you think that we need to create more employment very fast to bring these children back to the folds of school? Otherwise, despite having incentives, they may not be around their schools. They have gone away.
So I just wanted to add that while we had the we gave the place for questions, we didn't guarantee an answer.
But I can always expect an answer from a World Bank representative.
Yeah, that's right. And to say that, and to go back to what Rachel has said, that it's about listening. But what you have set us up for in this instance is that we have Mr. Vipin Kumar from MOE to speak to us in a little while. And I think much of what is being discussed is kind of making us more and more sort of excited to listen to his part of it. But would any of you like to say anything in this regard? Okay, yeah. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I had a question. I'm Dr. Preeti Oja. I'm working as a principal in a school. When we got exposed to digital network and our teachers got exposed to it, I'll come on the teacher's question. We all as a teacher have been conditioned in our own classrooms how we learned in 20 years of our own span of teaching. So when we get into this world of digital as a teacher, how much ever technicality comes into picture, we go back to our own base of how we were being taught. So I want to know how exactly can we work with our teachers who are already doing a wonderful work in the classroom, and how to use this digital world so that the evidences that you asked and you said that you have, how it can be given to the teachers in a way that whatever they have been doing in the class, they can use a little digital format there, but they can also come out with the best outcomes without putting a lot of effort of changing a lot in their pedagogy.
Rachel,
I'll just answer very quickly. I mean, I think that's a huge question, and it's an issue around the world. In Ghana, they call it chew and pour. The information goes into the mouth. It's rote learning, effectively, but the information comes into your mouth, you chew it, and you pour it out before it's entered your brain. It's just rote learning. It's a very big challenge. But here in India, you actually, 2 decades ago, I was down in Tamil Nadu, looking at your activity-based learning approach with incredible resources, incredible political will, and we took that model around the world, promoting it. And yet, just yesterday, when I was in a school, and they were doing teacher training on early childhood for interactive learning, a lot of the messages and lessons had been lost. And they were doing the same didactic teaching to the teacher trainers. So we need to remember what we already know. And I would also promote, I can't see in the audience, but we have a representative here from STIR, for example, STIR program. One of the things they're doing brilliantly is using WhatsApp groups to share what is already going on that teachers do well, and promoting it and encouraging that. There's some great practice here in this country. The challenge is, how do you incentivize teachers to do what they know is the right thing to do and what they know makes a difference? But thank you for the question. It's a really important one, not just here, but everywhere.
No, that's okay. You wanted to say something?
I think with technology, I think it's important to realize technology is an enabler, not a solution in terms of, and it's really looking at beginning small and building up things that teachers can do, and not trying to reinvent or radically change. And I think India has some wonderful training programs. TIS has one in terms of supporting teachers to use technology in classroom practice. So how can they leverage it to improve what they're doing, not simply change everything they're doing? Thank you.
And if you have any questions, there's also a resource of the edtechhub.org, which is, has a help desk function to ask questions about how do we use technology appropriately. And that's what the report, of course, calls for.
So thank you very much to all of you for being on this panel, for being resilient to the little bits of disruption and to being flexible. Thanks a lot. I'm sure it was a great experience for people listening, and you'll have lots of questions over teas and lunches. Thank you.